I have a range of projects that I've been working on, and today I want to talk about a couple of projects that have focused on how sarcasm plays out in online discourse. And that work is really inspired by some of the work I did here as a grad student and following my graduate student years here. And so this kind of builds on that, and so I wanted to present that today. Looking at some content analyses of sarcasm in the social media spaces, and also some effects of sarcasm in viral video content. So as I wanted to sort of start off by talking about the background that I come to this work from. As I mentioned, it stems from some of my work here, but it's part of a broader push in the field toward understanding what incivility in online spaces looks like. And so there's been a lot of work that has been done on this, including some of the work that I did with my colleagues here, looking first at defining incivility. What is that? And considering it to be explicit attacks that really go beyond a healthy, heated debate that sort of make up democratic discourse, that we want to have a healthy back and forth of discussion. But when we get into incivility, that can really start to dig into having people who attack others. Maybe it's an attack among the people who are having a dialogue, or maybe it's an attack on another entity outside of that discussion setting. And so this has been looked at pretty heavily in the field. Looking at some content analyses of incivility, where is it playing out, showing that it has a really persistent, consistent presence across a range of platforms and in a range of discussion spaces, essentially. So looking at things like newspaper comments, and some of the older work looks at old school discussion threads like Usenet and things like that, showing that it can comprise up to 20, sometimes 25% of posts in those kinds of settings. And so that really lends to wanting to understand what are some of the effects of that. And there's been a lot of work that has looked at the effects of uncivil comments, primarily in political communication, but then also in the science communication realm as well. And some of our work that I worked on while I was here as a grad student showed that effects of exposure to those uncivil comments can produce polarized risk perceptions, and seeing how risk perceptions can be heightened, especially across sort of existing divides in the public, and also produce more biased perceptions of the media. Again, along some of those lines of polarization, like political ideology. And so other work has sort of looked at, so why are people posting uncivil comments? And showing that, it's really intended to provoke reactions, cause emotional distress among people who are either reading it or who are the target of that incivility. And also sort of to entertain oneself as if we're considering who the commenter is, and to be humorous while doing that. And so that sort of provides some of the background on sort of where this work starts, right? We're considering this attack-based language, the major concerns over it, why it's happening and where it's happening, and the extent to which it's happening. And so I want to sort of start to talk about why we should look at that, look at other sorts of attack language in social media. And so that's where I start to focus on sarcasm here. It's really a subtle attack. It's still sort of attack-based language, and it's intended to provoke and cause that rise. But it relies more on irony and humor. And there are some different subtleties that are important to sort of note. One being that it's really about an interpretation among between the speaker and the listener or the recipient of the message, that they need to have some common ground to understand that humor and that irony that's sort of expressed through that opposite framing and that opposite language. And so so it's often coupled with sort of other constructs when it's looked at in content analysis. It hasn't been looked at very heavily, but when it is, it's part of impoliteness, especially when comparing it to incivility. And this goes back to some early work on incivility in online spaces, particularly Papa Carisi's work that looks at how sarcasm will play out, but as part of that construct of impoliteness. And it's not necessarily as sort of looked at as detrimental to the sort of healthy, heated debate as that explicit attack language is. But it's starting to be more commonly looked at in the literature, particularly as we turn to social media platforms to do these analyses. You know, a lot of the work has looked at incivility in newspaper comment spaces, blog comment spaces, discussion threads, things like that. But as we turn towards social media, we're starting to look more at that as a field. And so some of the work that looks at why people are using it looks at it as it's used to express affiliations and sort of build up relations and bond participants through that use of humor, right? And so that allows somebody to provoke somebody else while sort of saving face. And maybe it's helping them sort of use that as a persuasive tool, persuasive rhetorical strategy, while also sort of building that relation with the recipient of the sarcastic tone. And so it sort of, at the same time, we see this rise of visual-based social media. And so this is just some Pew data here that shows sort of how social media use has sort of changed over the years, and how, you know, generally we see these sort of bottom lines here represent things like Instagram, Pinterest, YouTube. All of those platforms are certainly gaining in traction that do tend to value and promote the types of content that would sort of promote more sarcastic tones, right? And so I'll give you some examples of what I'm talking about. In thinking about, you know, especially with the rise of memes and viral video content, that's where we see a lot of these sarcastic tones playing out. And so I pulled a couple of memes that are, you know, I didn't create these or anything. You know, one says, "Dad, what's science? I don't know, son, we're Republicans." Again, relying on that humor and that irony to make that jab, that subtle jab. And then this Onion, it's an Instagram post from the Onion saying, every year they predict human extinction within a century, and every year it doesn't happen. And it's under a headline, "Article predicts climate doomsday." And so we start to see, these are just a couple of examples that show how these kinds of tones are really valued and upheld a little bit more in that visual-based social media setting. So I want to talk about two studies today. The first is looking at a systematic analysis of attack-based language for science-related content on social media, using climate change discussions as that setting. Climate change discussions that happen among a setting of an extreme weather event. And then secondly, talking about effects of viral video content that rely on sarcastic tones, and looking at some initial analyses that I've done on that. This first study has been published recently in Science Communication, and I worked on that with my colleague Heidi Huntington. And the second study is, we've recently collected data, so we're in the process of moving that forward, and I did that work with my colleague Amy Becker. So let's step back and sort of take a look at this case study and where I'm studying the sarcastic tones for this first content analysis. In 2013, there was a multi-day flooding event. It happened over the course of 11 days, where there was essentially, well, it was an 11-day rainfall that happened in extreme flooding around the region, particularly in northern central Colorado. And so I use this as a case study for exploring communication around extreme weather events. I have a couple of other sort of lines of research that have come out of this particular case. But this just gives you an example of what it looked like at the time, right? When it was certainly something that held a lot of consequence, some immediate aftermath of this disaster-based event that was happening, essentially. And so here's just a couple of headlines. There was definitely mainstream attention to making the connection between climate change and this extreme weather event. In mid-drought, explaining Colorado's extreme floods, flash floods in Boulder area may also have ties to fire and climate change, to fires and climate change. And then prominent advocates on Twitter, like climate change advocates on Twitter, making those connections between this particular event and climate change, and ultimately sort of policy reports looking at those connections as well. So I just wanted to highlight that this is an event that is drawing out climate change discussion in mainstream media, in social media spaces. And extreme weather events are certainly, to sort of step back, and they're certainly a prominent space within the climate change communication research, because they are something that helps sort of reduce that psychological distance for people from this very abstract issue of climate change. And so you see this is a space where people start to make those connections between these crazy events that are happening and climate change as a construct, essentially. And there's, while people don't necessarily discuss climate change very much, the data is pretty low in terms of how often and people are discussing it, seeking out information in the media about it. They do talk about extreme weather events a lot, and the data show that. This is just sort of to show that, the majority of people will talk at least once, but mostly several times or many times with other people about an extreme weather event. And then that's happening over the phone, and then it's still happening over technological platforms as well, like sending emails and discussing over social media. And some survey data that I collected in 2014 after this event shows that Coloradans were reading about it in news media sources. Pretty much everybody was doing that. And there are fewer people sharing their experiences over social media, but they definitely were talking about it over social media. 31% were sharing personal experiences over social media, and almost 20% were sharing information from news media sources about the event over social media. So we can see that there's a sort of a heavy discussion and discussion around extreme weather events that has the potential to pull out those climate change connections that are, fueled by those mainstream media sources that we looked at earlier. Okay, so I did a content analysis of some Twitter data that happened during the flood. So I pulled just before the flooding event occurred and started to almost 2 months after the event happened. And looked at essentially any tweet that talked about those floods in conjunction with the terms climate change or the terms global warming or environment. And so I just want to talk about a couple of key variables and how they were operationalized. Incivility was definitely an easier construct to achieve sort of reliability among the coders who worked on this project. It was really looking at incivility as an explicit attack against an opposing idea, entity, or person. That was a little bit open-ended in terms of who that attack could be directed at, as long as it was that clear attack. And it often included disparaging remarks or expletives. Sarcasm, as you can imagine, was much easier to operationalize in the study. And so we started with this definition that it's a subtle, covert attack, drawing upon humor through irony. meaning that the meaning of the language is the opposite of what was being stated. And ultimately, we settled on it had to contain at least two of these other characteristics to be explicitly defined as sarcasm. So those were things like exaggerated or melodramatic statements, quotation marks, heavy punctuation, excessive use of capital letters, in conjunction with that sort of core definition. And so this helped us achieve reliability among the coders on a really difficult construct to analyze at that sort of quantitative level. And it's also a relatively conservative approach to understanding and identifying sarcasm. Okay, so one of our first findings is that instances of incivility and sarcasm were pretty low overall. We found that it was only used in about 3% of tweets in the sample for both, so a total of 6%. They're rarely used together, and essentially, I think really this points to the nature of the event that we were covering, right, and looking at, where there's a lot of discussions happening in sort of this immediate aftermath of a disaster event like that, right? And so drawing out that attack-based language in that event just didn't happen as much. We were looking specifically at those tweets that looked at climate change issues and global warming issues, though. And so we also wanted to see how it played out in terms of content, other sort of content themes, and who was using it. We found, I'll go through a couple of findings. Politics was more likely to be mentioned in the uncivil tweets and then the non-sarcastic tweets. So those political topics weren't necessarily drawing out that sarcasm, but they were drawing out that incivility in that uncivil tone. Incivility and sarcasm were more likely to be used in tweets that claimed no connection between climate change and the flooding. And so we were examining how are people, making that connection, saying things like, the climate change could be a cause of the floods, right? Or there's definitely no connection there. Or some sort of ambivalent connection or no connection was stated necessarily. So you can look at this as kind of more of a skeptical perspective on climate change. If they're sort of coming out and saying directly, there is, at the time when there's a lot of mainstream discourse around those connections, these are people who are saying there's just no connection between those floods and climate change as a cause. And then we also found that user profiles that are more likely to mention right-leaning politics versus left-leaning politics or some sort of other politics like independence, they were also more likely to be using incivility and sarcasm in their tweets. So just to sort of briefly discuss this first study, incivility and sarcasm first were used sparingly and separately. That points to this potential that there are different rhetorical strategies engaged in different ways. And so we found we definitely found some differences there, but then we also found some similarities in terms of the content themes that they're used with. I do think our study speaks to the need for further research on how group dynamics plays out and how that fuels sarcastic and uncivil language. We found that those tones are being used among climate change skeptics and among right-leaners. Both of those are sort of minority perspectives in the climate change discussion community, essentially. We know that climate skepticism, holds a place in online discourse. And we know people are willing to speak out on the climate issue, even if they do hold that minority perspective. There's some research that shows that. And so I think it's an interesting point, right? And so, you know, we can start to draw some tentative conclusions from that. This is one case study with one particular set of tweets. But that, you know, online discussion spaces are fueling some of those minority perspectives and providing that sort of platform in a way. And so I think we need some more research, though, on how that plays out in terms of group dynamics. Are those people relying on defensive, like uncivil tones, or humorous or sarcastic tones to let them sort of easily dismiss non-like-minded others while building rapport with others like them? That's not something that this study in particular can speak to, but I think is a question that, you know, we can start to speculate on. And we also found that political tones or political mentions drew out those uncivil responses, but not necessarily sarcasm. You know, I think that again speaks to the sort of immediate nature of discussions that were happening after this disaster event, where you have an opportunity to sort of directly attack maybe the political responses that are going on during this event, but you're maybe not going to start to engage in those more nuanced, subtle attack language that would be more of a sarcastic approach. Okay, so now I want to shift gears and talk about some other data that I recently collected looking at sarcasm in online video content. And I think I'll show like a few seconds of these different videos in a minute. The first is a weather channel. So these are actual videos that I tested in the experimental setting. And the first is more of a two-sided video it was produced by the Weather Channel. It's called We're Saving Small Talk, and it's really a video that pokes fun at both sides of this topic, right? That you have people who are tapping into this weather language and this weather space to start to engage in, you know, climate change is the problem and like raise concerns about it. And then you have other people who are like, oh, come on, it snowed yesterday. Like, you know, we're seeing, and so that video definitely pokes fun at both sides. So the sort of point of that is that this is an example of two-sided sarcasm. And comparing that to a video produced by The Onion, that's certainly more one-sided. And that is featuring a scientist who essentially is talking about the sort of level of conspiracy that would be needed to implement climate change as a hoax. And so that's more of a one-sided video. So anyway, as I mentioned, again, there's a sort of two-sided version versus a one-sided version. These are actual, you know, viral videos that I pulled off the internet. And so, you know, briefly, some of our findings show that there are effects for the Onion video. We didn't actually find effects for the Weather Channel, that two-sided video. For the Onion video, we found that people who sort of go into the experimental setting with low climate change importance, that they sort of rate that issue much lower than other issues that they tend to prioritize when they're looking at news about different topics. That video actually pulls them towards greater risk perceptions versus those people who already hold climate change importance, the high climate change importance. They react about the same to either having that video or not having that video. And we also looked at global warming belief certainty, how strongly you feel that climate change is happening and how severe it is happening, essentially. Showing that, again, for people who hold low climate importance, they're more likely to hold a higher belief certainty in global warming after seeing that video, versus people who don't have, or who are already high in climate importance, don't have much effects from seeing that video or not seeing that video. So there's a couple of things that I think are interesting to sort of pull out there. You know, one is that sort of the fact that we found those effects for that one-sided video speaks to that rapport-building nature of sarcasm in social media, where you can start to engage people who are, more like-minded as you within that sort of viral video setting, right? Using those sarcastic tones. And that those effects kind of get washed out, essentially, with the two-sided video, where you have both sides sort of being poked fun at, right? From a climate advocacy perspective, this fits nicely. This is a positive thing, right? Like, you can use sarcasm to engage others and engage people who don't necessarily think about the topic a lot, or it's not very important to. You can get them to be more concerned about it, and you can get them to believe that it's happening, right? And that kind of fits nicely with some of the political comedy literature, actually, that look at that satire as an engagement tool, essentially showing that, people can hold more knowledge following exposure to some of that satire, and showing that people can, be more concerned about political and social issues, essentially. And so, I think we can sort of step back and fit that into the broader social media literature as well, and thinking about are social media like positive spaces for engagement, right? Because there are some, in the climate change communication literature, there's some evidence that points to that. We see more opinion leaders coming out of those social media spaces, for instance. I pulled a graph from like another study that I worked on out of the extreme weather events work that I've done, showing that, for when people use social media around that flood event, they're more likely to engage in future information seeking, future discussion about global warming, if they already hold that high belief certainty in global warming. And so that's a sort of a positive look at. Social media is encouraging discussion among those high believers in global warming, right? And it's not necessarily encouraging or discouraging discussion among those low believers, which is good, right? From a climate advocacy perspective, you don't necessarily want those low believers to be fueled to search out more information that supports their points of view. But I also want to sort of point to this last note about there is kind of a polarizing nature of negative tones in social media, right? We started to see that in the incivility, the research on uncivil comments and the effects that those are having, where we do see some polarization across existing lines, right? Where the exposure to those uncivil comments can push people towards, more perceptions of bias and higher risk perceptions. And so there is certainly a sort of a positive way to look at these findings that are showing that, the satire is engaging people, but then you can also look at it as, okay, if you are building rapport among climate advocates, great. Are you also pushing away those people who aren't believing and who aren't already part of that issue? So I think that's something to sort of consider as well. And so I'm going to sort of end it there, and I look forward to hearing you guys' questions, comments, feedback.